Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Jeremy Oldham, the current base civil engineer and the commander of the 10th Civil Engineer Squadron, and I will be your narrator today for this event. First, I would like to introduce our host for the ceremony, the 21st Superintendent of the United States Air Force Academy, Lieutenant General Richard M. Clark. And unfortunately, we're missing Miss Amy today, but hopefully sometime soon we'll see her. As a reminder, because today's ceremony is indoors, military members should come to attention, but not salute during the national anthem. All other attendees will please stand, if able, face the flag, remove any headgear, and place their right hand over their heart. At this time, please stand for the singing of the national anthem by the United States Air Force Academy's Cadet Chorale.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you to the members of the Cadet Chorale for that beautiful rendition of the national anthem. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Chaplain Gaither, will you please come forward and offer the invocation?
Let us pray. Holy God, we cannot write the history of the United States Air Force Academy without remembering the name of Colonel Witters. And we cannot write our current story without thanking the men and women of the Civil Engineering Squadron. So today we gather to dedicate the 10th Civil Engineering Squadron building in the name of Colonel Arthur G. Witters. We remember Colonel Witters as the first director of installation of the United States Air Force Academy, and much of USAFA's development came under his command. We are grateful today that this building will bear his name and of someone who envisioned the space and spaces for academic development of our future Air Force and Space Force leaders. We thank you for the life of Colonel Witters and the men and women who continue to educate and serve this great institution of higher learning. Today we celebrate our Civil Engineering Squadron, and we are grateful for the airmen and our civilians who are the backbone of USAFA. Bless now these ceremonies and grant grace, mercy, and peace to us all. It is in your holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Chaplain. At this time, I'd like to introduce our distinguished guests. Please hold your applause until all have been introduced. Our guests of honor include Colonel Arthur G. Witters' daughter, Miss Ann Langen, Colonel Witters' son, Mr. Arthur Witters, and his spouse, Valerie, Colonel Witters' son, Mr. Curtis Witters, and his spouse, Claudia, Colonel Witters' son, Mr. Richard Witters, Colonel Witters' grandson, Mr. Jeffrey Witters, and family, Miss Sarah Mabey, and Colonel Witters' great-granddaughter, Noah. Miss Eula Harmon Hoff, daughter of our first superintendent, Lieutenant General Hubert R. Harmon. Major General John Wida, Director of Policy, Programs, and Strategy, International Affairs, Office of the Deputy Undersecretary of the Air Force. Mr. Gabriel Vallejos, Military Legislative Assistant to Congressman Lamborn. Mr. James Owendorf, Chief Risk Officer, Department of Energy. Our guest speakers for today's ceremony are Colonel Retired Thomas F. Hayden, former Civil Engineer Commander, United States Air Force Academy, and accompanying him today is his wife, Vicki. And Colonel Retired J. Bryce Hollingsworth, Assistant Architect to Colonel Witters during the design and construction of the Air Force Academy. Accompanying him today is his spouse, Anita. Although time does not permit me to introduce each distinguished guest, we extend a warm welcome to our Air Force Academy's senior leaders, mission element commanders and directors, command chiefs, former Air Force Academy leaders, former Air Force Civil Engineer leaders, our faculty and staff, members of the military, and civilian guests in attendance today. Ladies and gentlemen, the Superintendent of the United States Air Force Academy, Lieutenant General Richard Clark.
Everyone can hear me. All right, good. Thank you, Jeremy, Chaplain. Thank you for that wonderful prayer. Our cadet corral was awesome. Thank you all for being here today for this important and historic event for our Academy, and most importantly to the Witters family. It is so awesome to have you here and have spent a little bit of time with you. And Mr. Arthur, I have to tell you, I'm sorry, but it's not being named after you. It's your dad. Okay. Oh, you're Arthur. Okay. Yeah. What they were like, oh, this is me, right? No, it's your dad, but you claim it. So, but it really is fantastic for us to be here today to name our CE Squadron building after one of our founding fathers. And when you think about who we've named buildings after, you think about Harmon, you think about Fairchild, Saigon, Gregory, giants in the Air Force, giants of air power, people that we owe our service to, and today is no different. Because when you look out at our academy and you look at this site that we have and the buildings, it is just so inspiring and so incredible. And I think about when I was a 17-year-old in high school, and some of you are from Williamsburg, right? Who was from Williamsburg? Oh, yes, sir. Mr. Hollingsworth, that's right, was from Williamsburg. I had signed to go to William & Mary. That's where I was going to college. And I had signed on the dotted line. And I had a guidance counselor who said, hey, you ought to consider the Air Force Academy. And I actually went through the whole congressional process. I got my nomination, but I still wanted to go to William & Mary. And then the football coach called and said, hey, just come out and see the academy. Just come see it. That's all we're asking. And my mother said, you should go. It's a free trip. So I got on the plane and I came out. And I have to tell you, when I walked onto the grounds of this academy, it changed everything for me. And I just looked at the place and said, what an incredible, incredible institution. I hadn't even talked to anyone yet. Just looking at it and seeing the location, where it was, the site, the buildings, everything about it said, let's go do something great. That's what Colonel Witters did for us. He laid a foundation for something that was great at its inception and is only becoming greater. We are only moving forward because of the vision, the foundation, and really the thoughts of what air power needed to be, the thoughts of what the foundations of air power had to have to produce the leaders that were going to go take it to the next level. And now it's not just air power, it's space power. It's leaders throughout our country, congressional members, everything, every leadership opportunity that our cadets have, they owe their foundation here. And I have to say that it's not just about the civil engineering genius, but it's about the the foresight of what air power needed to be, and Colonel Witters got that naturally. He's a fighter pilot, a combat pilot, fought in World War II, saw what our Air Force might become one day, and knew that it needed something special to develop our future leaders. And that's what he did. And when we talk about the foundations, I was just talking to the family about what we hope it will become now with the Space Force and the opportunities that his vision has laid for us. I think it's just going to be absolutely amazing when we see the next steps and the next phases of our academy, but we take it all back. We take it all back to the beginning with people like Mr. Hollingsworth, people like Colonel Witters. But it is truly our honor, and I think when you look at that CE building, it's about the people, the men, the women, the capability that are there. Because when I first got here as a superintendent, the first thing I thought was, this place is like one big construction site. There's construction going on across this whole ground, but it's all based on progress. It's all about the foundation that we have and where we're going into the future. So today it is a great honor for us to be able to name our CE building the Witters building. And it talks about the future that we have in front of us, the leaders, the character that we're going to develop as a result of the work that our team does from that building. So I just want to thank everybody for being here today. I'm proud that we're able to call that building the Witters building, name it after a warrior, a visionary, a CE genius, and someone that I think will set a foundation for us, just like everyone else that our buildings are named after, the Fairchilds, the Gregories, the Harmons, across the board. So today, it's a great day. Thank you everyone for being here. Jeremy, back to you, sir.
Thank you, General Clark. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now hear from former Air Force Academy civil engineer, Colonel retired Thomas Hayden.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. General Clark, thank you so much. It's great to see all of you, even wearing masks. A lot of old faces, a lot of friends out there, old friends. You know, a previous superintendent advised me that I should open this up with a joke, an engineer joke. Now, I gotta admit, it's been 10 or 12 years since I've heard an engineer joke. I've heard a lot of lawyer jokes, but I'm gonna give it a shot. An optimist, what's the difference between an optimist, a pessimist, and an engineer? An optimist sees the glass as half full. A pessimist sees the glass as half empty. An engineer sees the glass as twice the size it really ought to be. Well, I guess that went okay. I met Art Witters in 2004, about 3 months before I retired after 30 years as an Air Force civil engineer. I wish I had met him much, much sooner. Art was the first USAFA engineer. I was the 18th. One day while I was out riding around inspecting a facility project, I got a call from my secretary. She said, "There's a colonel waiting for you in your office." Now, I knew I didn't have any appointments, so I rushed back, and it was Art and his wife, Bev. They were here to attend the National Landmark Ceremony held on 1 April 2004. Okay, he and I became instant friends. Of course, he was here as a founding father. He had been invited that way. And we spent the next, no kidding, 5 hours talking about the Air Force Academy, what he did to build it, and of course, base engineering issues and problems. We continued our friendship until he passed in 2011. Today, I'd like to tell you a little bit about this dynamic leader who, no doubt in my mind, he was destined to be by a higher authority to build this institution, the Air Force Academy. I think that you'll see what I mean in the next few minutes. and destined is the right word. He was an extraordinary Air Force leader and airman. He is extremely dynamic and charismatic. During his career, he amazingly met and worked with many key leadership figures in U.S. history. You're going to see that here. He was a spokesman and advocate for the Air Force Academy before, during, and after it was established. By his leadership and personal insight, he is even today directly responsible for many of the Academy's current day-to-day operations. They've lasted the test of time. Selected by the first superintendent, Lieutenant General Hubert R. Harmon, as the first USAF engineer, Colonel Witters' actions in the planning, repeated testimony to Congress, and supervision of the design and construction phases resulted in what is known today as the United States Air Force Academy. This is going to be kind of a history test today. I hope you'll have the test at the end, but this is the lesson part. First, let me get back to the days when Lieutenant Witters was a young man. Art Witters earned his degree in architectural building construction in 1941 and was commissioned into the field artillery of the U.S. Army on 15 September. At one point, a tasking came down and he became a temporary aide for a few months to then Major General Omar Bradley, simply because he was the only single person in the unit. Imagine that. He later bumped into General Bradley several times throughout his career. Eventually, as you know, General Bradley became a 5-star general. There's going to be a trend here, folks. During a field artillery exercise in February 1943 in North Carolina, in the 101st Airborne, he was tagged as an exercise prisoner. And so while he's sitting there tagged, he inadvertently met Commanding General of the Army Air Forces, Lieutenant General Hap Arnold, eventually another 5-star general. General Arnold asked Lieutenant Witters his opinion about how the exercise was going. After listening and asking Art about his source of his commission, General Arnold then asked Art if he ever wanted to go into flying training. Art gave him an enthusiastic, "Yes, sir." He got his wings in February 44 and completed fighter upgrade training in P-38s during August 44, and the next month he was in Europe. During World War II, Lieutenant Witters was an aggressive combat leader. He flew 66 combat missions in the European theater in P-38 and P-47 fighter aircraft, had 3 shoot-downs to his credit, was shot down twice, evaded capture twice, and returned to fly and fight each time. At one point in the war, he was detailed to be a forward air controller for a short time, and in this assignment, he met General George Patton. General Patton had some aerial support questions and demands, as you know General Patton always did, for him. Art later flew the historic missions to find General Patton's captured son-in-law. Lieutenant Witters was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and 8 air medals for heroic actions against the enemy. After the war, he was discharged. He applied for regular commission and was brought back onto active duty. Shortly after, the Army sent him to graduate school to get a master's degree in architectural engineering. He went to Iowa State College. He wrote his thesis on the planning needed to establish an Air Force Academy and developed the initial conceptual plan for its design. Our McDermott Library Special Collections section has his thesis. It's a duplicate of what you saw today, sir. In 1948, and because of this thesis topic, his extensive research, he was recruited, appointed to, and became a key player on the Air University's Air Academy Planning Board as a young captain, one of 23 officers. For his research, he contacted 44 universities, including all of the U.S. military academies, West Point, Annapolis, Coast Guard, military universities like VPI, VMI, Texas A&M, and 6 foreign military academies, all for input. During this research, he spoke to Lieutenant General Maxwell Taylor, the superintendent of West Point at the time. Do you see a trend happening here? While a member of this board, during meetings with the Air Force General Counsel, Pentagon lawyers, Captain Witters was tasked to write a draft bill, Bill 325, for the President of the United States to sign at the appropriate time. A few years later, 1 April 54, President Eisenhower signed this bill, creating the Air Force Academy. He later met and briefed President Eisenhower on the Academy plan, our 34th president, and another 5-star general. Now, I had to look this up. In American history, there's only been 9 Americans that have made the rank of 5-star general or admiral, and he's met 3 of them. In 1949, the Air Force sent him to teach for 3 years at a little place back east called West Point to get firsthand experience in daily cadet life and ideas of facility needs and improvements that could be made, with focus on improvements over West Point. You're supposed to laugh at that. During this assignment to West Point, Art became good friends with a guy named Colonel Bob McDermott. Ring a bell? It does to Academy grads. Another big name for us. Overall, his research and many, many contributions made him a crucial player in creation of the Air Force Academy. And let me mention a few of these. He used his research to help steer the Air Force Academy Planning Board while a graduate student. The Academy master planning he accomplished prior to 54 construction start was of great value later on. His pivotal guidance to the site selection board led to the selection and construction of this current AFA site. Now, there's a story here I'd like to share with you. After the Colorado site, there were 2 options, had been visited and selected out of several hundred proposed all across the country. General Harmon and Art visited the 2 sites, June 54. General Harmon was leaning towards the southern site, which is where the Broadmoor is today. But Art, after describing the value of the larger site to the north, which was Pine Valley site where we are, with an area to expand as the academy grew, and the ability to later add an airfield, General Harmon agreed. He made a convincing argument. Note that at the beginning, and not a lot of people know this, the Air Force was against having an airfield for any sort of flying training at the United States Air Force Academy. That's all documented. Then appointed to the temporary selection committee by General Harmon, he recommended to the committee the site at Lowry Air Force Base in Denver. This committee consisted of Art and 5 2-star generals. After that, he led the design and construction of that temporary site at Lowry. He developed all 82 of the permanent site facility design directives. And a directive is those facility design requirements that the AE used, the architect engineer uses, to design the place. All building areas, all building systems, utility systems, road networks, landscaping, everything for each one of the original buildings on the academy. He managed the design contractor with the day-to-day direction of all the design details. Then he provided the critical oversight of the massive, massive academy construction effort that was being accomplished by the Air Force Academy Construction Agencies, AFACA. During the design phase, he established a user oversight committee for all Academy senior staff to participate in the development of facility designs, a process still used across the Air Force today. As we all know, it's extremely important, always important, to get user input. His achievements go on and on. He had a keen eye for detail. His innovative methods made it possible for the first 3 graduating classes to consecutively begin in 55, 56, and 57 at the Lowry site, and then for the first graduating class of 59, to graduate here at this site. Class of 59 arrived here in August 1958 and graduated on 3 June 1959. Because of his professionalism, integrity, and amazing foresight, Early on in this design process, he was named by the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, with concurrence by General Harmon, as the only person authorized to brief Congress on Air Force Academy matters. He did so a total of 22 times. You can see how much confidence General Harmon had in Colonel Witters. After 4 years here, the Chief of Staff offered him a position at the Academy for the rest of his career. He decided to leave in order to get the required flying hours in order to keep his flying rating. Colonel Witters then commanded a flying squadron, a civil engineer squadron, and completed a tour as a base commander. Leadership positions. In July '61, he became the chief of the Architectural Division of the Air Force under then Chief of Staff General Curtis LeMay. Another big name. You can imagine working for General LeMay. In '62 and '63, General LeMay named him as the architecture engineer consultant for the design of the Cadet Chapel. Had his fingers in that. Colonel Witters has another distinction. He is the one person most responsible for the existence of the Cadet Field House. Now, here's another story, folks, that I can't pass up the opportunity to tell you about. General Harmon had to redline the field house from the original construction because of what we all know about cost overruns and budget concerns, budget cuts. He always regretted having to do that. General Harmon and Art had become very close in those years. The week before he passed, General Harmon made Art promise that he would someday find a way to get the funding for the field house and build it. In early '65, while working for General LeMay, Colonel Witters saw an opportunity. He devised a plan. Still designated as the only person on Air Force Academy matters to testify before Congress, he was supposed to testify with superintendents of West Point and Annapolis for the Military Academy Expansion Program. This was to make all three service academies the same cadet strength. This initiative was started by President John F. Kennedy, because Kennedy noticed that the Navy had 4,300 cadets, the Army and Air Force had 2520 authorizations. He designed and built the conceptual model with the help of young son Curtis, took it to the Pentagon, and briefed congressional leaders and conceived a plan, this time with General LeMay, to get the necessary funding. How did this work, you might want to ask? I did. General LeMay brought a congressional committee leader into the plan. It was a Congressman Ebert. The result was that Colonel Witters briefed the House Appropriations Committee, chaired by L. Mendel Rivers, and was successful in obtaining project insertion and funding. Not an easy task to do. However, there was a game plan here. They even had Air Force Academy graduate, extreme athlete, Doc Blanchard, some of you know that name, in the audience to support what Congressman Ebert was saying. Funds were now approved after having been denied several times at the DoD level for higher priority projects. Art's own design model concept was used in the final design: hockey, basketball, and track, all under the same roof. The field house was designed, constructed, and opened in May of 1968. Colonel Witters had fulfilled his promise to his dear friend, General Harmon. When Art retired in 1965, Air Force Secretary Zuckert appointed him to the Air Force Academy Expansion Advisory Board. As a retiree, Colonel Witters advised the Air Force for another 5 years on all matters pertaining to the United States Air Force Academy. To conclude, I think you can see that he was a key figure in making history happen. For his immense contributions to the creation of the Air Force Academy, Colonel Arthur Witters certainly commands respect as a founding father. This was a great man who was destined to build the United States Air Force Academy. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Hayden. Ladies and gentlemen, former Air Force Academy Assistant Architect to Colonel Witters, Colonel Retired J. Bryce Hollingsworth.
If you will excuse me, at nearly age 91, I'm going to sit down. It's such an honor for me to be here today, and a bit emotional. I'm very happy to be here. In fact, I'm very happy to be anywhere. I was privileged to work with Art Witters for 5 years, my first 5 years of active duty in the United States Air Force. 3.5 of those years were in person, and as I will tell you later, with other people. How did I meet him? Well, I was an armament officer student at Lowry Air Force Base when one Sunday morning on the front page of the Denver Post, I read an article about 3 young majors coming from the Pentagon to Lowry Air Force Base to open and start up the Air Force Academy. Those 3 people were Major Hutto, who was the first supply guy, Major Hunter, who was the first administrative guy, and Major Arthur G. Witters, the first installations guy. I thought to myself, as a registered architect in an armament school, what the heck am I doing here? So I went in the next morning, talked to my instructor into getting me an appointment with Art Witters. At 10 o'clock the following Saturday morning, I reported to him in Building 903 at Lowry Air Force Base, and I expected 15 minutes of his time to convince him that I was a graduate architect from Kansas State University. I had a professional license to practice architecture and had been doing so until called to active duty by the Air Force. 2 hours later, we were close friends. He wanted to know about my background. He told me everything he could tell me about the academy, which wasn't much as far as the permanent site. Are we okay? Not much about the permanent site, but he knew a lot about what was going to start up at Lowry Air Force Base. At the end of that 2 hours, he took me up to the office of General Harmon. I was wowed as a young lieutenant to meet a 3-star general. Sort of like going before the 12 disciples, you know. And I expected 5 to 10 minutes with him. He shook my hand, sat me down, and he said, "Tell me about your background, Lieutenant," and I did. "And tell me about how you would practice architecture," and I did. And he says, "What do you think you could contribute to the Air Force Academy?" And I shared my thoughts with him. That took a half an hour. At the end of that half an hour, he picked up the phone, called Lieutenant Colonel Cook, who was the first director of personnel. So he came into the office and he said, "This is Lieutenant Hollingsworth. He's a student at Lowry Air Force Base. I want him transferred to Art Witters' staff now." "Sir, that'll be a bit of a problem. The Air Force has a policy." Thank you. The Air Force has a policy of students not being transferred out until they have completed the coursework. "Colonel, the Chief Staff of the Air Force told me," said General Harmon, "I could have any officer I wanted to start up this Air Force Academy. I want Lieutenant Hollingsworth to work for Major Witters." 2 weeks later, I was. The day I walked into the office to go to work for Art Witters, he sat me down and he said, "We have a problem. Well, that's the way that every morning seemed to start for the next 5 years. But what's the problem, sir? And he says, I got a call several days ago from the Director of Engineering Installations for the Air Force. He told me I was found to be the most qualified person to write the design directives for the Air Force Academy. He said, how long will you take it, Major? And I thought for a minute, and I said, 3 months, sir. It was quiet. He says, Major, you have 2 weeks, and hung up. He says, we have 2 weeks, Lieutenant. He says, I've started writing on the 8 buildings of the campus, and first thing we're going to do is sit down and go over my list, which I now found was in his thesis, and see if we have a complete list. And we thought of a few more items, and when we were concluded with that endeavor, we had a list of 82. He says, here's my notes that I've written so far. I want you to read them and give me your thoughts on them. And I did, and after he read those, he says, okay, here's how it's going to work. You're going to write a bunch of the others. I'm going to write a bunch of the others. You're going to review what I write. I'm going to review what you write, and then we're going to caucus and finalize it. And we did that. Well, that took 14 to 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 2 weeks and 4 days, and we were done. Those 82 design directives created what was originally built up on these 17,000 acres. When that was concluded, we sent those to Skidmore, Owens & Merrill through the construction agency, and Skidmore, Owens & Merrill used those to develop the master plan of the Air Force Academy. The next thing he said to me, he says, I'm swamped with work getting the SOM started. We have to buy all this land. We have to survey the boundaries of all this land and stake them. We have to fly the entire 17,000 acres and produce a contour map of every acre. Otherwise, SOM won't know how to plan the Air Force Academy. I've hired an architect engineer firm to build the interim site, to develop the designs of the interim site. They're half done. He says, I've arranged with the contracting officer at Lowry Air Force Base to negotiate the construction contract. We don't have time to advertise. He says, you have $1 million. You have the contract for the architect engineer, Wilson and Company. Get to work. Oh, and incidentally, you have 10 months before the class reports, the first class. Well, that led to a lot of more hours of night time and weekends. But when we were done, some of the paint was a little tacky into the barracks, but the cadets moved in. First thing I did was establish a priority of design. We had staff arriving, and we had Commandant of Cadets people, and we had faculty arriving, and they needed offices. And there were some of those offices were going to be in the temporary building. So I said, we're going to do the office work first. We're going to do the things that the cadets need when we start up that take time to equip second, and that was things like the mess hall, the social center, the gym, the medical facilities, the chapel. And he says, we'll do the design of the barracks last because they're going to stand empty until the cadets arrive. And we got it done, and the cadets moved in time. During all that was half my workload. The other half, and remember, at this point in time and for the first 5 months of the Air Force Academy, Art Witters, his secretary, and me were the entire staff of the installations office. Halfway through that time, we did get in 5 engineers, 4 more secretaries, 4 draftspersons, and that greatly enabled us to work a lot more. And then the secret weapon arrived, Charlie Hammond, and he was the deputy civilian to Colonel Witters, and he helped Colonel Witters tremendously. But anyway, we have to stop my thoughts here. First thing we did was the second thing we did was start reviewing the designs that were coming in from SOM. SOM had produced a master plan and briefed the Secretary of the Air Force and his folks and had approved it. And we had been given authority not to change anything on that master plan as far as the size and shape of the location of the building, but we could do anything we wanted inside those buildings. So there's 3 steps of design: schematics, design development, and contract documents. We reviewed at the Air Force Academy the first 2 steps by calling in anybody that had arrived that was going to occupy those buildings, and then the staff of the installations organization, my engineers and so forth. By the way, one of those engineers was a guy by the name of George Toothaker, and he bought a house on Payne Street, Payne, but I'll never forget that name. Anyway, we would review those, and Art Witters would chair those meetings, and when he would absent, either Charlie Hammond or I would, and we would go over those plans, make all the changes we wanted, and then change the drawings and send them back to SOM. We did that through the first 2 steps. We had an agreement with the construction agency, but once we approved the designs of the design development drawings, they couldn't change, the construction agency, couldn't change anything without our approval. Those drawings were what the construction agency used to put the buildings out for bid. About that time, Art Witters said, "Lieutenant," and we sat down about once a month for about 2 hours, and he would instruct me, give me advice on how to be an officer in the United States Air Force. What not to do, what to say, how to organize my organizations, how to treat people, what social functions I was expected to participate in, and so forth. He was a teacher, and he became not only my first commanding officer, he became my personal friend and my mentor for nearly 60 years. Anyway, the next thing he did was send me to Air University to attend Squadron Officer School. And when I came back, we had received several officers into the installations organization, one of which was Jack Price. Major Price had been assigned to Art Witters for the intent of him becoming the first base civil engineer. He sent me, Art Witters sent me PCS to the permanent site to start up the civil engineering squadron that's there today. I was followed a couple of weeks later by Jack Price. I set up my first office in an indigenous building. My first desk was 2 sawhorses, a sheet of plywood, a scarf from a contractor. My first chair was a wooden crate intended for shipping whiskey bottles, unfortunately empty. But it didn't take long for supply at Lowry to get us down truckloads of GSA gray metal furniture, and that's what we lived with for a long, long time. When Jack arrived, he opened his office in an indigenous house that he moved his family into. That is what it was located, what is now the parking lot for the building we're here to dedicate Art Witters to today. We started interviewing civilians for the civil engineering squadron. We received military enlisted and officers for the civil engineering squadron. And in about 4 months, as I recall, the complex for the civil engineer, which we had appropriated, we had scheduled to be the first building to be completed at the Air Force Academy, opened. And we did that because we knew we were going to accept the real property from the construction agency, and we had to have a place to work to operate and maintain it. So the first buildings that were not only designed and put out for bid and completed were the civil engineering, the vehicles, the wing headquarters building, the warehouse, security, police, and a heating plant for that complex. That was the first buildings completed, and we all kind of moved in simultaneously. I started accepting contracts completed from the construction agency. I had the engineers, real property records, surveying, and the drafting people in the first civil engineering squadron. As we accepted the real property, we took over the responsibility to operate and maintain the Air Force Academy. That only lasted for me 6 months, and then Art Witters called me on the phone. He says, "Lieutenant, get your ass back up here to Lowry, we got a problem." So I moved back. I had bought a house in Colorado Springs. My family was living there. I moved back to BOQ at Lowry, and he said, "First of all, you've got a tremendous problem with costs." He says, as you know, we included a suggested budget for each of those 82 line items in the design directives. We have yet to receive a schematic or a design development drawing with SOM's budget that didn't exceed that amount. He says, we've cut out all the family housing except for the senior officers' quarters and the quarters for the Protestant Catholic chaplains. We've cut out the field house, we've cut the airfield. And that's going to get us started. But he says, we've discovered a way we can save some more money for the construction program. What's that, sir? He says, we've noticed as SOM has completed the drawings, they've completed a finished building. Everything you can think of to make that building operate for what it was intended. We've reached an agreement with Headquarters Air Force that we can take out of that anything not directly involved with the operation of the shell of the building. So we're putting out construction drawings that build the shell and put in the HVAC, heating, ventilating, and air conditioning systems to make it operated, and it could be done for anything. But anything in that building in the way of cabinet work, portable partitions, carpeting, drapes, training aids, the SOM is lockers, and the SOM is including in the contract documents, we're taking out and moving into the operating budget of the Air Force. We need to identify all those items and get those drawings changed. And that's the first thing we worked on. And that saved $26 million out of the original $126 million for the construction budget. All that item was transferred into a separate program under the DCS materiel of the Air Force Academy. And he says, you're going to work for Colonel Jones, who was head of it, and get those things designed, built, and bought on an installed basis. Now, I'm talking about all the buildings on the campus, the hospital, the officers club, and the VOQ next to it. Those were the buildings in that equipping program. And when you included the $26 million worth of installed items with all of the furniture and all of the accessories that it takes to operate the building for its intended purposes, that was a $56 million program. And he says, Colonel Jones is going to ask you to help him get that done. And I reported then to Colonel Jones, and for the next year and a half, I worked with Walter Dorman Teague Associates, an industrial design firm in New York City, and they produced the designs and the contract documents for us to put those things out for bid. Everything that was installed or connected to utilities, I had responsibility for. All of the loose stuff like furniture and chairs and desks and so forth, another officer was responsible for placement. But we had to make templates from that equipment. I gave them to the construction agency. They had to write change orders with the building contractors so that the right size pipes, the right size wires were located at the right point for that equipment to be connected when it was installed by the manufacturer. My job was to visit all those plants all over the United States, set up production lines, approve first articles off the production lines, and schedule the shipment of that equipment to that warehouse right over here in the service supply area, where it was unloaded. The contractors that were installing stuff picked it up and installed it wherever it was going to go and what building. And the other officer I spoke of hired a moving company, and they took all the loose stuff and packed it and took it up and located it. And when the cadets moved in, we can operate the Air Force Academy. Art Witters and I remained friends for the rest of our life. I talked to him so many times on the telephone. We communicated by letter. We visited each other's families. After we both retired, he moved to Florida, and that contact became even closer. I had 2 more events with Art in his life and mine that are significant. First of all, after I retired, I worked for other architect engineer companies until I reached the age of 64. I got fed up with working for somebody else, so I started up my own architect engineer company, Hollingsworth Corporation, and Art Witters was the founding father of that organization. We spent hours together on the telephone, me learning how to set up a corporation for architect engineer business and how to operate it and how to advertise it, get customers and so forth. That organization opened with one person, me. A year later, I doubled the employee relationship, but it's been in existence now for 26 years. We have 4 offices in the United States, 3 overseas. We have a separate corporation in Denmark. We have associated organizations in Puerto Rico and Argentina. We have 150 to 160 employees. Somebody in HP is working 24 hours, 5 days a week. Our main product is the design and construction of embassies for France, Denmark, and the United States. And all that growth was directly because of Art Witters Association. Now, what was he like to work for? That's an interesting question. First of all, he was not a micromanager. He would call me into his office. This is what I want done. This is my suggested budget. This is the ultimate goal, and this is how long I think it should take. I want a weekly briefing on the status. Go to work. He never once told me how to do something. That was my responsibility. And I learned so much from that process. The second thing that he did was one day, for years, myself and others have been trying to get him to write a book about the Air Force Academy construction program. Finally, he decided to do it. And he called me one day and he said, Bryce, he says, I've typed up the first rough draft of the book. Would you review it for me and tell me what you think? And he mailed it to me and I read it. And I was very impressed with it, but it had some things I thought should be told in a little different, better way or so forth. So I said, here's my notes, Art, do with them what you want, you know. And then he called me back and he said, I want you to help me finish this book. And we went through 3 or 4 iterations of what the book was to be. And finally, he was satisfied. I put the final copy in my computer, made all of the changes. And then he said, please suggest a title for the book and a design for the cover. And I did that and sent them to me. And then he said, let's put some pictures in it. So we went through his collection of photographs and my collection of photographs, all of them 35 millimeter slides, and you've seen most of them up here on the wall today. And I inserted the appropriate ones in the book, sent it back, and he had it printed. It's called Off We Go. Well, it was an instant success. We got many compliments. Art was asked to autograph dozens of copies, and a lot of copies was given to the AOG for their purposes. We've tried, the family has tried to send a copy to each new superintendent that's reported. And once in a while, I see a copy for sale on Amazon. In fact, just recently I saw it, called it to the attention of one of my doctors. He bought it off of Amazon, gave it to me to autograph and sent it to his brother who had served at the Air Force Academy. So that was my life with Art Witters. He was a scholar, a gentleman, and my mentor and my close personal friend. I can think of nobody else in my association of life that had more effect on what was built at the Air Force Academy initially. He was truly the founding father of the facilities at Air Force Academy, just as much as General Harmon was the founding father of the Academy in toto. He was my closest association friend and mentor, and had, other than my father, I had no one else that had more effect on my life. As I walked these surfaces of this globe for nearly 91 years than Art Witters. I miss him every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Hayden, or excuse me, Colonel Hollingsworth. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, we'll invite Lieutenant General Clark and the Witters family to come forward for the unveiling of the United States Air Force Academy Civil Engineer Building sign in honor of Colonel Arthur G. Witters. Yes, sir. I apologize. Missed that. So we'll hold on that. We'll hear now from Mr. Arthur Witters, son of Colonel Arthur G. Witters. Thank you.
When I volunteered to do this, I never realized it'd be this many people. And I'd like to thank every one of you on behalf of my family for being here. You've heard all the wonderful things my father did. I'm just to tell you a little bit about him as a father. He raised 4 kids. We all went to college. One of them graduated from the Air Force Academy. As the namesake, it probably should have been me, but if you saw my high school records, you would understand why it was not me. I ended up being a high school football coach for 45 years. General, I did have a player that I think it was Coach Hatfield called, and he said, "You've got a kid that runs 9.8 that's got a 4.4 GPA. I'll take him. I don't even need to see film." He ended up at FSU because Coach Bowden called him, and now he's the general manager of the Washington football team. But, and Bryce, I didn't know you went to Kansas State. I have a former player's son who's the super running back for Kansas State now, Deuce Vaughn. As an old coach, I had to say that. The Air Force has been my life. From the time I was born, my brothers were born at West Point. Talking about big names, I think Vince Lombardi lived down the street from us. My brother Kurt made the model that he's pictured with General May, showing it to General May. My sister was married in an Air Force chapel at Bowling Wright sits, and was married to a big guy in the State Department. Like I said, my youngest brother graduated from the Air Force Academy. When I talk about my dad, words like cozy, and they're not really there. He was a firm taskmaster. If he were alive today to be here, this would not be on my face. I would be 65 years old and go visit him, and he would ask me why there are no barbers in Tallahassee. as you can see, his hairstyle. My closest connection to the Air Force, other than remembering General Harmon, the name General Harmon, who, without begrudging my grandfather, I'm sure my father loved more than his father. I went to visit my mother. The last time I spoke at an event here, we were burying my father in 2011, and I couldn't get the words out. Now it's much happier. We went and visited him yesterday. I went and saw General Harmon's grave, General Briggs, all these names that I grew up in the Air Force. You know, my claim to fame was I played Little League Baseball for the Lowry Mustangs. So I do have a direct connection to the Air Force. We lived everywhere, from Newfoundland, Brooklyn Air Force Base, McGuire Air Force Base, the Pentagon. Kids today, when I was a football coach, he said, yes, sir, and no, sir. I learned that from my father. You didn't answer the phone. Hello? You answered the phone, Colonel Witters' quarters, George speaking. You lived on military bases where you didn't have to lock your doors. You didn't have to lock your car. Unfortunately, you had to buy your clothes at the BX, and you had to go to the commissary. I guess the last story I want to share, I shared this with my nephew the other day, because the academy has been part of my life. My dad never talked about World War II. I'd ask him questions, but he would never talk about it. I don't know what it's like to see. I do know he said, that guy's never seen a man killed in anger. That was like one of his, so it must be tough. And I congratulate every one of the men and women that go to this place to make our life available as it is. But it's always been a close place to me, because you went in his living room and there was a piece of the downspout, is that what it was? But it was on the wall. You know, he was a great interior decorator. Where the chapel leaked, he had a piece of aluminum. He had a, whatever they call that stick in a P-38, that he had one of those framed on the wall. Is it a sword of yours that he had on the wall from the academy? And he always spoke of the academy with a little glint in his eye. I always spoke of General Harmon. And the final story is, my wife and I travel now, and we were in Venice, Italy, a few years ago. And we're standing in line to get back on one of those little boats to go back across the canal to our hotel. And this guy's got a Gator hat on, and I'm a University of Florida graduate. So I went, hey, go Gators. And he said, hey, and I looked, and he had, because I knew my brother, he had an Air Force Academy ring on. I recognized the Star Sapphire. So I said, did you go to the academy? He went, yes, sir, I did. I said, I play golf twice a week with a graduate of the Air Force Academy, General Mike Snodgrass. And he went, he was my roommate. So I'm standing on a pier in Venice and meet the roommate of an Air Force cadet of General Mike Snodgrass, who's my golf buddy. I thought it was kind of ironic. Once again, everyone here, thank you. When Bryce said, now I want to tell you what he was like to work with, I kind of shuddered a little bit, because I knew what it was like growing up. But he did a great job raising all of us, and this is an incredible honor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Witters. I apologize for my oversight. Now, at this time, we'll ask General Clark and the family to come forward to unveil the sign rendering.
Thank you, sir. Get my mask here. Thank you.
Can we take our masks off?
Yeah. I got all my stuff. Come on, man. Come on. Let the old lady work. Ready?
Here, you set
I
up.
hope. That's right. Wait. Get the video going later. I think they've got a camera line. Ready? Here, we can all do for one still photo. Okay. Sorry. We'll get one. We'll all. Oh, very good. Yeah.
Everybody right here on three.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for making time to share this special event with us. A special thanks to those who worked diligently to bring this effort to fruition. There are many heroes within the proud history of the Air Force whose stories and contributions are not known today by many of their beneficiaries. We hope to write this in some small degree as we honor one of those heroes. Colonel Arthur Witters not only answered his nation's call to serve in a time of war, but it seems as if he was destined to play a major role in establishing the United States Air Force Academy. From being selected from his field artillery unit to attend flight training, surviving being shot down twice, and completing a design for Air Force Academy as part of his graduate studies, it seems as if there was a greater plan to make sure that the Air Force Academy was done right. And Colonel Arthur G. Witters was key to making it done right. It is altogether fitting that we should honor this hero that built so much for thousands that have come after him. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the singing of the third verse of the Air Force song by the Air Force Academy's Cadet Chorale.
Off we go into the wild blue yonder, climbing high into the sun. Here they come, singing to meet our thunder. Adam love, give 'em the gun, give 'em the gun. Down we dive, striking our flame from under. Off with one hell of a roar. We live in fame or go down in flames. Ain't nothing can stop the U.S. Air Force.